Pay attention to the man in the gray t-shirt in this gym security footage. November 12th, 2018. In the foreground, 25-year-old Emily Vance is confident, checking her form in the mirror. The man behind her seems focused on his workout, but look closer at his eyes. He isn't looking at the weights. He is staring directly at her reflection. He sits on the bench, freezing 14 times in 45 minutes, just watching. Emily thinks she's safe in a public place. She isn't. She doesn't know that to this stranger, her tight gym clothes aren't fashion, they are a sin that needs to be cleansed. 4 days later, Emily was found dead in her apartment, her workout gear slashed to pieces around her body. Before we reveal the evidence, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next case. The high-angle security camera mounted in the corner of Titan Fitness captures the mundane rhythm of a Monday evening. It is November 12th, 2018, and the digital clock on the wall reads 6:45 p.m. The gym is alive with the after-work rush, a sea of moving bodies, clanking iron, and the low hum of treadmill motors. In the center of the free weight zone, standing before the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, is Emily Vance. The camera quality is sharp enough to catch the vibrant energy she projects. At 25 years old, with her brown hair tied back in a high, practical ponytail, she moves with the focused determination of someone who enjoys the discipline of training. She wears a matching set of athletic wear-tight black leggings and a sports bra that highlights her physique. To the casual observer, or anyone walking past her, she is simply a young woman taking care of her health, completely absorbed in her routine. However, the camera lens reveals a second figure, one that does not blend into the energetic atmosphere of the room. Situated about 10 feet behind Emily, seated on a flat utility bench, is Mark Halloway. He presents a stark contrast to the colorful, moisture-wicking fabrics worn by the other members. He is dressed in a faded, loose-fitting gray t-shirt and heavy black trousers that pool around his ankles, attire entirely unsuited for vigorous exercise. He holds a 20-pound dumbbell in his right hand, resting his elbow on his knee as if preparing for a set of concentration curls. But he doesn't lift. He doesn't move. For the first 5 minutes of the footage, Emily performs a set of lunges. She is facing the mirror, checking her form, correcting her posture. Behind her, Mark Halloway's head is tilted slightly down, but his eyes are raised, fixated on the glass in front of him. He is not looking at his own reflection to check his form. He is looking at hers. The mirror provides him with a perfect, uninterrupted line of sight to her body while allowing him to maintain the facade of a man resting between sets. Other gym-goers walk between them, a teenager in a hoodie, an older man with a towel, but Mark's gaze does not break. It cuts through the moving crowd, locking onto Emily with a predatory intensity that feels heavy even through the grain of the video recording. At 7:02 p.m., the behavior becomes more pronounced. Emily switches to lifting dumbbells, her movements rhythmic and controlled. Mark has now been sitting on the same bench for nearly 20 minutes. He has completed exactly 3 repetitions. The camera captures a chilling detail. He freezes. His hand grips the dumbbell on his knee, his body goes rigid, and he simply stares. In the span of 45 minutes, a forensic analysis of the footage will later show that he freezes like this exactly 14 times. Each pause lasts anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes. He is totally motionless, like a predator in tall grass, waiting and observing. His face, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent overhead strips, is devoid of expression. There is no lust, no smile, just a cold, clinical observation. Emily pauses to drink from her water bottle. She wipes sweat from her forehead and glances at her phone, likely checking a playlist or a text message. She smiles at something on the screen, a moment of private joy in a public space. She has absolutely no idea that 10 feet behind her, a man is dissecting that smile. To Mark, as later psychological profiles would suggest, her confidence is not a virtue. It is an affront. He watches the way her clothing moves with her body, the way she catches her breath. He watches her with a judgment that has been festering in his mind for decades. projecting a lifetime of distorted hatred onto a stranger he has never spoken to. Around 7:20 p.m., a personal trainer walks past Mark and seems to glance at him, perhaps noticing that he has been occupying the equipment without really using it. Mark immediately shifts. He lifts the weight twice, feigning effort, blending back into the scenery. It is a calculated camouflage. As soon as the trainer's back is turned, the weight goes back down to his knee, and the eyes return to the mirror. He is not there to build muscle. He is there to feed an obsession. The session begins to wind down at 7:30 p.m. Emily re-racks her weights. She stretches her arms overhead, a movement that draws Mark's gaze to follow the line of her body upward. She grabs her gym bag and towel. As she turns to leave the free weight section, she walks directly past where Mark is sitting. She passes within 2 feet of him. She doesn't look at him. To her, well, he is just background noise. Another anonymous man in a gray shirt. She exits the frame, heading toward the locker rooms. Mark does not leave. He does not finish his workout. The camera captures him swiveling his body on the bench. He watches her receding figure until she disappears around the corner. He remains there for another minute, staring at the empty space where she had been standing. Then, slowly, he stands up. He doesn't wipe down the bench. He doesn't put the weight back on the rack. He places the dumbbell on the floor with a deliberate, heavy thud. He stands with his hands in his pockets, looking once more into the mirror, not at himself, but at the spot in the glass that held her reflection moments ago. The gym continues to bustle around him, oblivious to the fact that a target has just been marked. The relentless Seattle drizzle had turned the morning of November 16, 2018, into a gray, oppressive wash of color, matching the growing anxiety inside the offices of Summit Marketing Group. Emily Vance was never late. In 3 years of employment, she had been the definition of reliability, often the first to arrive and the last to leave. But for the past 4 days, her desk had remained empty. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and her emails remained unread. When she failed to appear for a crucial 9 a.m. client presentation, her supervisor, Jessica Lewis, decided she could no longer dismiss the gnawing feeling in her gut. This wasn't a case of the flu or a spontaneous vacation. Jessica made the call to the Seattle Police Department at 9:15 a.m., requesting a welfare check on her colleague. She emphasized that Emily lived alone and had no family in the immediate area, making her silence all the more deafening. At 10 a.m., a patrol cruiser pulled up to the curb of the brick apartment complex on 4th Avenue, where Emily rented a third-floor unit. Officers Daniels and Russo shook the rain from their jackets as they entered the lobby. The building was quiet, typical for a mid-morning on a weekday. They buzzed apartment 304 repeatedly, but the intercom remained silent. After 10 minutes of failed attempts to make contact, they located the building superintendent, a weary-looking man named Mr. Henderson, who fumbled with his master key ring, muttering about how Emily was a quiet tenant who never caused trouble. As the elevator ascended, the air grew heavy, a psychological weight that often precedes bad news. When they reached the door of number 304, Daniels knocked firmly, announcing their presence. "Police! Miss Vance! Are you in there?" The only response was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Mr. Henderson unlocked the door, and the officers stepped inside, guns drawn but lowered, anticipating a medical emergency rather than a crime scene. The first thing that struck Officer Russo was the temperature. The apartment was freezing, the thermostat likely turned off days ago. The second was the eerie orderliness of the living room. It didn't look like a home that had been lived in recently. It looked like a showroom. A coffee cup sat on the coaster, perfectly centered. The throw pillows were fluffed and arranged symmetrically on the sofa. There was no clutter, no mail on the counter, no shoes kicked off by the door. It was sterile. As they moved deeper into the apartment, the silence felt suffocating. The kitchen was spotless, the sink dry. It was as if the occupant had simply evaporated, or as if someone had meticulously wiped away the chaos of daily life. Officer Daniels moved toward the hallway leading to the single bedroom. The door was closed. He turned the handle, which gave way easily. As the door swung open, the smell hit them, not the overwhelming stench of decomposition yet, as the cold apartment had slowed the process, but the unmistakable metallic scent of dried blood. Daniel signaled for the superintendent to stay back in the hall. The beam of their flashlights cut through the gloom of the bedroom where the blinds were drawn tight. There, lying on the bed, was Emily Vance. She was still wearing the clothes she had likely come home in days prior. It was immediately apparent that she had been gone for some time. The violence inflicted upon her was concentrated and brutal, ending her life quickly, but it was what surrounded her body that made the veteran officers recoil in confusion. The room was a scene of calculated devastation, but not of the robbery variety. On the dresser, Emily's purse sat open. Inside, her wallet was visible, with cash and credit cards untouched. An expensive laptop sat on the desk, ignored. Instead, the violence had been directed at her wardrobe. The closet doors were wide open, hangers stripped bare. The floor around the bed was carpeted in a layer of shredded fabric. It was a specific collection: spandex gym leggings, sports bras, fitted tank tops, and short skirts. Every single item of clothing that could be deemed revealing or athletic had been pulled from the shelves and drawers. They hadn't just been thrown, they had been destroyed. The fabric was slashed with a sharp instrument, ribbons of neon pink and black lycra draped over the foot of the bed and around the victim's body like a grotesque ceremonial offering. It looked less like a murder scene and more like a ritualistic purging. The killer had taken the time to sort through her life, judge her belongings, and execute a punishment on the garments that defined her confidence. In the center of this fabric chaos, the rest of the room remained disturbingly neat, reinforcing the terrifying realization that the killer had stayed long enough to clean up, fueled by a calm, twisted sense of righteousness. The walk back to his apartment on 6th Street was a journey through a vacuum of absolute silence, at least inside Mark Halloway's mind. While the city of Seattle breathed around him, sirens wailing in the distance, tires hissing on wet pavement, Mark heard nothing but a soothing, low-frequency hum. It was the sound of a job well done. He arrived at his building, a decaying structure with peeling paint and hallways that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and damp wool, at 9:45 p.m. He didn't rush up the stairs. There was no adrenaline dump, no trembling hands, no looking over his shoulder for pursuing police cars. Those were the reactions of criminals, and Mark did not view himself as a criminal. As he unlocked the door to Unit 2B, stepping into the stale air of his sanctuary, he felt a profound sense of realignment, as if the world had been tilting on its axis and he had just set it straight. The apartment was a mausoleum to a childhood that never ended. The furniture was sparse and brown, remnants of the era when his father was still alive and ruling the household with a bottle in one hand and a belt in the other. Mark locked the deadbolt and went straight to the bathroom. The fluorescent light flickered on with a sickly yellow buzz. He stripped off the gray t-shirt and the black trousers. They were damp, not just from the Seattle rain, but from the exertion of his correction. He plugged the sink and turned the faucet to scalding hot. He didn't use a washing machine. This required a personal touch. He poured bleach into the basin until the fumes stung his eyes, then submerged the clothes. His hands, large and calloused, moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic precision. He scrubbed the fabric against itself, watching the water turn murky. To anyone else, and this would be the frantic destruction of evidence. To Mark, it was a baptism. He was washing away the sin he had been forced to touch, purifying himself after stepping into the filth of Emily's world to pull her out. He moved to his own body next. He took a bristled brush and scrubbed his fingernails until the skin beneath them was raw and red. He needed to be clean. As he scrubbed, the narrative in his head solidified. He hadn't hurt Emily Vance. The woman in the gym, the woman in the mirror, the woman with the tight leggings and the provocative stretch. She was a vessel of corruption. She was a siren luring good men to their ruin, just as his mother had lured his father into a life of misery before abandoning them. By ending her, he hadn't committed murder. He had performed an exorcism. He had saved her from her own vanity. She would never again look in a mirror and use her body to manipulate. She was safe now, and she was pure again. The violence of the act, the slashing of the clothes, the silence of the room, it all faded into a necessary background noise, the unpleasant medicine required to cure the disease. Drying his hands on a rough towel, Mark looked up into the medicine cabinet mirror. The glass was spotted with age, and for a moment his own reflection seemed to warp. The face staring back wasn't just his own. The jawline seemed harder, the eyes more sunken. It was the face of his father, Frank Halloway. Mark blinked, but the presence remained. He could almost smell the cheap whiskey and stale tobacco that used to cling to his father's flannel shirts. In his mind, the memory was so vivid it superimposed itself onto reality. He saw his father sitting in the dark living room behind him, nodding slowly. "You see them for what they are." "Ah, boy," the voice echoed in his memory, a raspy whisper from years ago. "They dress like that to mock us, to leave us." Mark nodded back at the mirror. He had proven himself. He wasn't the weak, crying 4-year-old watching his mother pack a gym bag with her colorful spandex before walking out the door forever. He was the enforcer. He had stopped the cycle. He walked into the living room, clad only in his boxers. The apartment was cold, but he felt warm. On the small side table next to his father's old armchair lay a stack of fitness magazines he had collected over the years. Not for fitness, but for target practice. Faces of smiling, fit women were scribbled over with black marker, eyes crossed out, mouths sewn shut with ink. Tonight, he didn't need to scribble. He had touched the reality. He sat in the armchair, the springs groaning under his weight, and closed his eyes. The image of Emily, finally still, finally modest in death among the ribbons of her destroyed vanity, he played in his mind like a comforting lullaby. There was no guilt, no fear of the police knocking on his door. Why would they punish a man for taking out the trash? Mark Halloway drifted into the deepest, most peaceful sleep he had experienced in years, convinced he was the hero of the story. By the afternoon of November 19th, the investigation into the murder of Emily Vance had hit a wall of forensic silence. The crime scene unit had swept apartment 304 3 times, dusting every surface, vacuuming for fibers, and swabbing for genetic material, but the killer had been a ghost. There was no foreign DNA, no latent fingerprints on the doorframe, and the lack of forced entry suggested a terrifying capability for stealth. Detective David Miller sat at his desk in the West Precinct, staring at the whiteboard where Emily's life was mapped out in marker. It was a grid of normalcy: work, coffee shop, grocery store, home. The killer hadn't left a physical trace, which meant Miller had to find a behavioral one. He turned his attention to the one variable in her schedule that involved prolonged public exposure: Titan Fitness. If the killer hadn't stalked her from the street, perhaps he had hunted her from a place where watching was socially acceptable. Miller drove to the gym, a knot of intuition tightening in his stomach. Inside the cramped manager's office at Titan Fitness, the air smelled of stale protein powder and electronics. The manager, a nervous man eager to assist, pulled up the server files for November 12th. Miller and his partner stood behind the desk, eyes scanning the grid of camera feeds. When they isolated the high-angle shot of the free weight zone, the room went quiet. They watched Emily enter the frame, vibrant and alive. Then Miller pointed at the screen. "There," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Pause it." In the background, a man in a gray t-shirt sat on a bench. As they played the footage forward at high speed, the gym bustled with chaotic movement. People walking, lifting, stretching. But the man in gray remained a static, dark anchor in the moving sea. He was frozen. Frame by frame, Miller analyzed the angle of the man's head. He wasn't zoning out, he was locked on. The forensic psychologist later brought in to review the tape would describe it as predatory stasis, the behavior of a hunter minimizing movement to avoid alerting prey. The contrast between Emily's dynamic workout and the man's rigid, cold observation sent a chill through the veteran detective. It wasn't just rude staring, it was an act of consumption. The identification process was swift and damning. The gym's digital entry logs provided a timestamp for every member who swiped in that evening. By cross-referencing the time the man in the gray shirt entered the frame with the swipe data at the front turnstile, a name materialized: Mark Halloway. A background check revealed that Halloway was 35, unemployed, and, most critically, lived in a rundown apartment complex on 6th Street, less than 3 blocks from Emily Vance's front door. He wasn't a stranger. He was a neighbor who had been hiding in plain sight. Miller didn't wait for a warrant for a conversation. He secured a warrant for an arrest based on the circumstantial strength of the stalking behavior and the proximity to the crime scene. The SWAT team assembled at 6 p.m., the rain still falling over Seattle, masking the sound of their approach. They breached Mark Halloway's apartment with a battering ram, expecting resistance, but the apartment was empty of people. Mark was gone, likely out on another walk. However, the apartment itself spoke volumes. It was sparse, smelling faintly of bleach and old paper. While searching the bedroom, Officer Daniels pulled a drawer out of the nightstand and found a leather-bound notebook. It looked like a standard workout log, the kind bodybuilders use to track sets and reps. But when Miller opened it, he realized it was a ledger of obsession. The pages were filled with dates, times, and descriptions, but not of weights lifted. Halloway had been documenting women. There were detailed notes on their attire, their workout routines, and their violations of modesty. Pages 45 through 48 were dedicated entirely to Emily. Her schedule was mapped out with terrifying precision. At the bottom of the last entry, dated November 12th, her name was circled in jagged red ink. Next to it, Halloway had written a phrase that confirmed his motive and his madness. "She is poisoning the air. She needs to be cleansed." The book was the roadmap of a killer's mind, and it placed him squarely in the shadow of Emily Vance days before she died. Mark Halloway sat in the sterile, gray confines of Interview Room B at the West Precinct, his hands handcuffed to the metal table, yet he looked more like a man waiting for a bus than a suspect facing a life sentence. It was 11:45 p.m. on November 19th, just hours after his arrest. Detective Miller sat across from him, the recording device humming between them. Miller had expected resistance, lawyering up, or perhaps the manic raving of a lunatic. Instead, he got the calm, articulate lecture of a man who believed he was the only sane person in the room. When Miller laid out the evidence, the journal, the footage, the slashed clothes found in the dumpster behind Mark's building, Mark didn't flinch. He nodded, acknowledging the facts, but when Miller used the word murder, Mark finally reacted. A frown creased his forehead, a look of genuine disappointment. "You're using the wrong word, detective," Mark said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Murder implies malice. Murder implies I hurt an innocent person. I didn't murder Emily Vance. I stopped her." To understand why a 35-year-old man would bludgeon a stranger and shred her leggings, Mark took the detectives back to 1987. He was 4 years old. He didn't remember the politics of the time or the cartoons on TV, but he remembered the smell of aerosol hairspray and the crinkle of neon spandex. His mother, Elena, was a creature of that era's fitness, craze beautiful, vain, and constantly checking her reflection. Mark described her with a mix of reverence and revulsion. She spent her days at the local gym, obsessing over her glutes and waistline. Then came the day the suitcase appeared. She wasn't going on a family trip. She was leaving Mark and his father, Frank, for her personal trainer, a man with tanned skin and bleached teeth whom she had met between sets of squats. Mark remembered clinging to her leg, begging her to stay, but she had simply peeled his fingers off, checked her makeup one last time, and walked out the door to start a new, better life, with a man who appreciated her body more than her family did. That door closing was the end of Mark's childhood and the beginning of his indoctrination. Frank Halloway, a man already prone to a temper, dissolved into a bottle of whiskey and never climbed back out. For the next 14 years, until liver failure took him, Frank used Mark as the audience for his drunken sermons. The house became a temple of bitterness. Every night, with the smell of cheap liquor filling the living room, Frank would drill the truth into his son's malleable mind. "Look at them, Mark," he would slur, pointing at women on TV or walking down the street in athletic wear. That's the uniform of a traitor. A woman who dresses like that, who flaunts herself in a gym, she's advertising. She's looking for the next branch to swing to. He taught Mark that vanity was the root of all betrayal. He taught him that a woman who seeks physical perfection in a public space is incapable of loyalty, that she is a parasite waiting to destroy a family just to feed her ego. This twisted curriculum became Mark's reality. He didn't hate women. He hated what he called the gym whore archetype. When he walked into Titan Fitness and saw Emily Vance, he didn't see a marketing executive relieving stress. He saw Elena. He saw the brown hair, the confident posture, the way she admired her form in the mirror. In Mark's hallucinated reality, Emily wasn't checking her squat depth. She was preparing to leave someone. She was preparing to destroy a husband and abandon a child, just as his mother had done. I watched her for weeks, Mark told the silent room. I saw the signs, the way she smiled at her phone, the way she wore those leggings. She was getting ready to upgrade. By killing her, Mark believed he had saved her future husband from heartbreak. He believed he had saved a future child from being left alone at the door at 4 years old. In his mind, the violence was a preemptive strike, a necessary act of mercy for the hypothetical victims of Emily's vanity. He looked Detective Miller in the eye, his gaze steady and terrifyingly sincere. "I didn't do it for me," he said. "I did it for the family she hadn't destroyed yet." The King County Courthouse in May 2019 felt less like a house of law and more like a final, somber reckoning for a city still grieving its sense of safety. The trial of Mark Halloway was a swift but agonizing affair, drawing a massive crowd of spectators and media outlets. Inside the mahogany-paneled courtroom, the air was thick with tension, as the prosecution displayed the evidence that had become the hallmarks of the case: the high-angle gym footage, the blood-stained ledger of obsession, and the haunting photos of Emily's shredded athletic wear. Mark sat at the defense table, dressed in a muted suit that seemed to swallow his frame, but his posture remained eerily identical to the man on the gym bench. He was rigid, unmoving, and utterly disconnected from the sorrow vibrating in the room. Even as Emily's mother took the stand, her voice breaking as she described her daughter's plans to start her own marketing firm, Mark didn't blink. He stared at her with the same predatory stasis that Detective Miller had first identified on the security tapes, his eyes devoid of empathy, seemingly analyzing her grief as just another symptom of the poisoned world he had tried to fix. The defense team attempted to build a bridge of sympathy out of the ruins of Mark's childhood. They called forensic psychologists to testify about the devastating impact of his mother's abandonment and the toxic indoctrination by his alcoholic father. They argued that Mark was not a monster by choice, but a byproduct of a broken home, a man whose reality had been so thoroughly distorted by trauma that he truly believed his violence was a moral necessity. They showed photos of the 4-year-old Mark in 1987, a small, frightened boy standing next to a father who had already begun to rot from within. They hoped to secure a verdict of diminished capacity, seeking a sentence that would land Mark in a psychiatric facility rather than a state penitentiary. However, the prosecution struck back with devastating clarity. They argued that while Mark's past was tragic, his actions were calculated, disciplined, and fueled by a choice to hunt. They pointed out the meticulous way he had cleaned the crime scene and the cold logic of his journal entries. To the jury, Mark wasn't a man who had lost his mind. He was a man who had refined his hatred into a lethal weapon. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreman stood to read the verdict, the courtroom fell into a silence so profound that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like hammer blows. Mark Halloway was found guilty of murder in the first degree with aggravating circumstances of stalking. As the judge prepared to hand down the sentence, he asked the defendant if he had anything to say to the Vance family. Mark stood up, his gaze sweeping over the weeping relatives in the front row. He didn't apologize. Instead, he leaned into the microphone and whispered, his voice barely audible but chillingly steady. "You cry because you are blinded. The air is still poisoned. I only tried to clear it." The judge, visible, disgusted by the lack of remorse, sentenced Mark Halloway to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remarked that Mark was a demon forged in a past he refused to escape, and ordered him to be removed from the court immediately. As the bailiffs led Mark away, he turned his head one last time to look at the reflective glass of the gallery partition, perhaps searching for one final reflection to dissect. The case of the mirror stalker was officially closed, but the legacy of the crime lingered long after the cell door slammed shut. The community of Seattle found their daily routines forever altered. The casual safety of a public gym or a quiet apartment hallway now felt fragile. Emily Vance's death became a grim, cautionary tale about the invisible dangers that hide behind a blank stare and the terrifying reality of how a dormant childhood trauma, left to fester in the dark, can eventually explode into a nightmare. In the end, Mark Halloway was buried alive in the prison system, but the shadow he cast over the city served as a permanent reminder. Some ghosts of the past don't just haunt the person who carries them, they kill. The case of Emily Vance is officially closed, but the haunting image of Mark Halloway's unblinking stare in the gym mirror remains. He didn't shout, and he didn't cause a scene when he sat on that weight bench. Instead, he occupied the silence for 45 minutes, freezing 14 times to dissect a stranger's life through a pane of glass. It serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't always the ones who scream. They are the ones who watch, judge, and wait in the shadows of their own twisted morality. What is your verdict on Mark's motive? Was he a tragic victim of a shattered childhood, forever haunted by the ghost of his mother's betrayal? Or was he a cold-blooded predator who used a 30-year-old grudge as a justification for murder? And ask yourself this: in a world where every public space is monitored, how many other silent observers are sitting just a few feet away, projecting their own darkness onto you? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the psychology of a killer and want to uncover more dark secrets hidden behind the lens of security cameras, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell right now. We have many more case files to open, and you won't want to miss what we find next. Thank you for watching until the very end. Stay safe, and remember to be mindful of who might be watching your reflection tonight. Good night.